Okay, hey all, I'm back. Hopefully my audio is working here. Um, so we will, in this segment or this unit of the lecture, talk about serial killing and mass murder. Um, so getting started here, we actually have to kind of define what these terms mean, um, because even the interest that we see in them in the scientific literature, but particularly pop culture. I mean, there's so many of these types of shows that deal with, real crime stories, homicide, serial killing, mass murdering, and of course the news um, gets a field day anytime one of these types of events happen here. But for the longest time, and well, even to this day, most homicides, most murders are committed by people who were acquainted with their victim. Uh, they had some type of personal but rational motive for killing this person, for killing their victim. And most of these killers have only killed once, and then they are arrested. So that makes up the vast majority of homicides that occur. It's a one-time deal, and there's a reason for it, right? This person probably owed you money, or they wronged you in some way. They slept with your husband or your wife or whatever. Um, but there was some reason for them to do it, and they're arrested, and that's kind of the end of it, right? When we take a look at serial killing and mass murder, both of them are are extremely rare. We hear about mass shootings all the time, and of course, especially when it happens in a school, um, well, when it happens anywhere, it's one time too many. But they still only make up a fraction of actual homicides that exist. Serial killers make up an even smaller fraction of homicides. Um, Serial killing is pretty rare, but there, as we'll discuss in this chapter, there are some common traits among serial killers, or at least among certain types of serial killers, and there are some common traits among mass murderers as well. So even though the vast majority are single-time events where a person knew their victim, and they had some reason, we're not saying it's justified, we're not saying murder is good or anything, but there was some reason why they killed that person. Um, in the past 2 decades, particularly, past 20, I'd say even maybe 30 years, there's been this increased tension, not just increased attention, but almost like fascination with patterns of homicide involving killers who attack multiple victims, sometimes with irrational or bizarre motives, or motives that we don't even really understand or know about, and who are much less likely to be apprehended than in previous days, because their victims are not known to them. Their victims are strangers, right? So this idea of mass killing and spree killing and serial killing, um, has kind of taken hold in our culture. Um, Something that we all tend to be, kind of interested in, and hopefully the readings will be interesting for you this week, along with the what we just discussed in terms of profiling, because these often go together. Profiling and serial homicide, serial killers, or plenty of movies and novels have been written about this stuff. But how do we actually define, like, what actually makes a serial killer? What actually makes a mass murderer? There are various definitions, various ways to define it, but when we talk about multiple homicides, um, the Fox and Levin in their 1998 article offer a pretty good description that is usually generally accepted in this area of research. And they define multiple homicides as the slaying of four or more victims simultaneously or sequentially by one or a few individuals. Right? So when we talk about multiple homicides, we're talking about four or more victims that are either killed all at once or they're killed in a series by either one or quote unquote a few individuals. Doesn't really specify how many individuals have to be involved, but if we take a look at the Manson murders, the Manson family murders, we could definitely define those as multiple homicides. There were more than four victims involved, and there were a handful of people who were involved in killing those victims. So two types of multiple homicides have typically been identified or typically get spoken about, and that's mass murderers and serial murderers, or mass murderers and serial murderers. So mass murderers will kill four or more victims in one location during a few minutes to several hours. So mass murders it's usually a one-time event. Even if it takes place, we'll see in a minute here that researchers make a distinction. There's another label for spree murderers, but mass murderers can move to another location, but it's all still considered a single event where four or more people are killed. And again, it could be all at once, or it could take place over a course of several hours. Mass murders, even though we hear about them, quite frequently in the news, are actually pretty rare. About 2 mass murders were committed every month in the U.S. in the 1990s, and I mean that sounds like a lot, and yeah, that's too many per month, definitely. But when we take a look at the actual death rates, these 2 mass shootings or mass murders, they're not all just shootings, typically they are, resulted in about 100 victims annually. So 2 mass murders a month is a lot, right? Still, we're talking about less than 100 victims in total. Now, we've had a couple recent big ones in terms of mass shootings that have kind of upped these numbers from the 1990s, but they've remained relatively stable. Mass murders are still relatively rare in terms of homicides. They make up just a fraction of the number of people who were murdered every year. When we talk about some of the statistics or some of the characteristics of these mass murders, in almost 80% of the cases, the assailant knew their victims. So in almost 80% of these mass murders, it wasn't just some random person shooting into a crowd. It's usually a disgruntled worker at a job, and for various reasons, this being one of them. When somebody's terminated from a job, it's usually kind of done very quickly, and the idea is to get them out of the building as soon as possible, and to try to prevent any type of retaliation here. Even though mass murders are rare, they tend to happen because of some type of disgruntledness. So even either in the workforce or when we talk about school shootings. But in many of these cases, the attacks are very well planned out. Sometimes the assailant or assailants, plural, um, will actually plan the attack for months before it actually happens. And we saw that in Columbine, that it was a very well organized massacre of students there. So although most mass murderers are not severely mentally ill, they do tend to harbor very strong feelings of resentment and are often motivated by revenge on people who they perceived as being, that they've been wronged by, right? So most mass murderers are not psychopathic. They're not even necessarily diagnosable with a major psychiatric disease, but they're motivated by strong senses of a strong sense of revenge and retaliation. So the typical assailant is actually killed at the location of the crime, and that's either that they are killed by the police or they will kill themselves by suicide, or once in a while they will surrender to the police. We've actually seen a couple of instances of that in recent years, of these mass shooters who surrender to the cops. And without getting political, but we see that some of these mass shooters are actually treated pretty well by the police once they are apprehended and or surrender. And but when I say treated well, I mean that they're actually afforded their constitutional rights, and we can't necessarily say that to about people who get pulled over for traffic stops sometimes. So again, not to get political here, but a subset of, say, these mass murderers is something known as spree killers. And spree killing is a special form of mass murdering, and it involves the attacker killing victims at 2 or more different locations without a cooling off period, right? So there's no cooling off interval between the murders. So what do we mean by that? Well, this whole idea of a cooling off period is something that we see in serial killers, which we'll get to in a moment here. But typically with the serial killer, they will have a strong desire to commit murder, to kill somebody, and after they're done with that murder, they kind of feel a sense of relief. And sometimes, well, we'll see, oftentimes it's actually a sexual type of relief that they feel, or release that they feel. And the need or the feeling or desire or drive to kill again might not come about for a while. Sometimes it's years between victims for serial killers. Sometimes it's a lot sooner than that. But serial killers will find some type of cooling off period where they're kind of relieved from this strong desire to kill. With spree killers, so when we talk about spree killing, it's a form of mass murder, but it happens in different locations, and I mean, it could happen over a series of hours or even days or maybe even weeks. So when we take a look at, say, the DC snipers, this was a father-son, if I'm not mistaken, father-son um, pair of killers who were basically shooting people on the Beltway in DC. We kind of consider them as spree killers. They certainly killed more than 4 people. It happened at different locations technically, and at different times. But we could consider them all out of one event, that they went on a killing spree, right? There was no cooling off. It's not that like they shot a bunch of people and then they were good for a few years, and then they went out and shot a bunch of more people. It was kind of all seen as one event, um, over an extended period of time. So the killing in a spree killing constitutes a single event, but it can either last only a short time or it could go on for a day or even more, right? So, but it's all kind of treated as a single event. Serial killers, to be a serial killer, you have to murder 4 or more victims, but they have to be each on separate occasions. And when it comes to serial killing, it's different from, say, mass murder or spree killing, because there is this cooling off period that we were talking about. The murderer is relieved of this kind of desire to kill. Also, serial killers tend to have a particular type of victim that they will target, and it's usually not people that they know. They're not killing people out of vengeance or for revenge, necessarily, right? Could be complete strangers, but they have a certain type of victim, that they like killing, that satisfies their need, or that who they will target. The serial killers tend to be more difficult to apprehend because they come off as pretty freaking normal, right? So they're hard to identify, because they blend in to the community, so they come off as normal community members there. And we'll talk about why in a moment. Well, here you go. Here's some of them. Mostly because serial killers tends to be like a white guy type of thing. There are, of course, exceptions. There have been black serial killers, and there have been female serial killers, but with white guys, we tend to have this tends to be our jam right here, right? So serial killers are mostly white males in their early 30s. They're typically employed at the time of the offense. Approximately a third of them are married at the time of their offense. Their victims are often white females in their early to mid-30s who are strangers or just neighbors, say acquaintances, but not friends, not co-workers, not relatives. They tend to be more distant. If there is a relationship, it tends to be pretty tangential in that regard. More than half of the murders are sexually motivated. So when we talk about serial killing, and when you listen to serial killers talk about their murders, they will often describe sexual pleasure that they get from killing, even if they are not sexually assaulting their victims. and even if they're not orgasming, climaxing, they still have a inner sexual type of um, desire that is satisfied by murder. And it says more than half. I would say way more than half. I would say the vast majority have some type of sexual motivation associated with them. Serial killers will prefer to kill with hands-on methods, so that tends to be different than mass murderers who tend to prefer using guns. And as we discussed in the profiling lecture, shooting somebody is typically, less personal than, say, some of these hands-on methods, such as stabbing somebody or even choking somebody. Right? Choking someone to death with your bare hands is pretty intimate. So we can, think about that word intimacy and closeness for serial killers as maybe fulfilling some type of sexual desire that they have, or that is released by killing. Serial killers will often keep souvenirs of their crime. They want to remember what they did, and it's not just a token as to remember how many victims they had, but serial killers tend to have a sexual and sometimes bizarre obsessive type relationship, what they believe is a relationship to their victims. So keeping souvenirs of their victims is a way for them to kind of keep their victims with them at all, like always, right? So there's like a weird type of desire or to stay with those victims. It's not solely there to say like get off from remembering, how they killed their victims. Of course, that could be part of it. But for some serial killers, just having a piece of the victim, and I say a piece of the victim, that could be literally or figuratively, reminds them of their connection and that kind of intimacy that they had while they were actually killing their victim. So all of this stuff sounds psychotic, right? But most serial killers are not psychotic. They understand right from wrong. They do have empathy. When if this is an area of interest for you, serial killers. There's plenty of biographies out there. There's plenty of interviews with serial killers that you can even watch on YouTube. And, some of them definitely have psychotic tendencies, like, say, Ted Bundy clearly was extremely manipulative, very charming, classic type of psychopath, attractive, ladies' man type. But most serial killers aren't. They don't have those types of social skills, and they're not devoid of empathy. However, most have some type of personality disorders, and they might the ability to experience remorse or to experience their empathy, even though I would say when you take a look at some of the more prominent, more famous serial killers, they tend to dehumanize their victims. So that suggests to me, I'm not a clinician and I'm certainly not an expert in serial killers, but if you have to dehumanize somebody before you kill them, that suggests to me that that you are capable of viewing them as a human, right? So if you have to dehumanize them, that's basically what makes killing people easier, is by not viewing them as real people. So they might lack some remorse, or they might lack some empathy, but or the ability to feel empathy. But most serial killers will tend to dehumanize their victims, which actually suggests that they are capable of empathy. They, they just, have a way to make themselves not feel it by making them believe that they're not actually killing another person. They're killing some unperson, some dehumanized type of person, right? Okay, so something that we've definitely been dealing with as a society for quite some time now is this notion of school violence. And even on campus, we had not long ago, a year ago or so, we had an shooter scare. Unfortunately, it's not that uncommon for those types of scares to happen nowadays. But still, the prevalence of school violence in terms of mass shootings, they're still relatively rare events. Just when they happen, there tends to be a high casualty count. And they tend to get lots of media attention. But when we talk about the most prevalent types of school violence, it's usually in the form of bullying and other types of altercations, assault, and battery, so on and so forth. So one example here, or one statistic here, in 1999 to 2000, 71% of students reported experiencing one or more violent incidents. That's a lot, 71%. That's a sizable majority. And 20% reported serious violent incidents, including rape or a physical fight with a weapon, or robbery with or without a weapon. Only 36% of schools actually reported one or more of these incidents to the police. So again, these statistics are a little dated here, but not a whole lot has changed. Schools are still very reluctant to address school violence, and they'd be more likely to chalk it up to kids being kids, or bullying. Once you start reporting stuff to the police and putting things in writing, it might start making the school look bad. So another statistic here: 17% of high school students at that time had carried a weapon, a gun, a knife, or a club, sometimes a hitting device, at least once in the previous month. So that's still a sizable number of students who are carrying weapons in school, and that could be, for their own protection, or to, of course, assault other people there. So school violence is a pretty important topic. When we think about school shootings, even though I said, these are still pretty rare, when they do happen, they're extreme. They're, mass casualties, and they destroy communities, right? So some common characteristics that we see in shooters in schools, well, one, they tend to be male. So when we say that common characteristics that are identified in boys who are responsible for school ground killings, for these mass shootings, Um, and, serial killers tend to be male. Mass shooters, mass murderers tend to be male, and white as well. Um, so some characteristics is that they tend to have a lot of experience with firearms at a very young age. So and I grew up on Long Island when guns were not really a thing out there, right? And then I spent my early adult life, I spent 10, 12 years living in Brooklyn, where, yeah, the only way you could have a gun is if it were illegal. And then I moved up here and, met people who hunt and who have shotguns and stuff for home protection. And, at first I was like, what? This guys are crazy up here, right? But no, not necessarily. It's it all depends on I think when it comes to everything, there's no black and white there. So a lot of experience with firearms in a rural area um, might be seen differently than a lot of experience with firearms in, say, a suburban area or an urban area, right? So none of these things in and of themselves should be taken as warning signs or red flags. But unfortunately, they often do. They often are taken as warning signs and red flags, and sometimes that leads to, kids being unfairly targeted and being unfairly, um, let's say, singled out for as potential school shooters. So it's important that we try to be fair and rational when we do these types of evaluations, um, which we'll talk about in a moment. But when it comes to, again, some of these more common characteristics, isolation, feelings of isolation, rejection, or torment by classmates, particularly relating to rejection by the opposite sex. We seem to this seems to be a running theme that we see, and there's a whole community called of incels, mostly on 4chan, but also on Reddit. And incels stand for involuntary celibates. So basically, young guys who can't get laid and are very angry about that, and very angry at women or young women who won't sleep with them, or very angry with the guys who are getting laid, the young guys who are getting laid. So this tends to be, a common characteristic. Also, preoccupation with various forms of violent media, and I put a big asterisk next to that one because, you know, I'll date myself here, but um, I was a teenager when Columbine happened, and Marilyn Manson got a whole bunch of shit. Basically, got blamed for Columbine, um, and Marilyn Manson. You wouldn't necessarily know by looking at him. He's an incredibly intelligent person who is very capable of defending himself and holding his own and discussing societal issues. This whole idea of music or video games or violent TV is causing us to go out and act aggressively towards one another. The research just doesn't support that. There's plenty of people who play violent video games who don't go out and commit violence in person. I will say here the word to, because I hate censorship so much, and it's a big thing when I was growing up with school shootings and stuff. And I wasn't even a Marilyn Man. I was into Nirvana and Riot Girl, punk rock type of music, but it still kind of like pissed me off. Like, how are you blaming music for this type of stuff? It seems kind of silly, and that was before I was even a psychologist, and the research kind of backs me up there. Research, people who are uh, it's kind of a chicken and the egg type of thing, right? So people who are naturally aggressive are going to gravitate towards very violent sources of media, but that doesn't mean that just because people are viewing or engaging in with this type of violent sources of media that they're violent people. Like I said earlier, everyone loves serial killers, right? We all watch documentaries on that. We all watch Forensic Files, and we all watch CSI and all those other shows. Doesn't necessarily say anything about us, except that, yeah, we're human. We're morbidly curious. That's why people slow down and cause traffic jams when there's a car accident. They're not trying to be safe. They pass the accident. They're trying to see if they see any dead people or blood or something over there, right? That's what we do. It's just the way it is, right? But say a preoccupation with this type of violent media could be a sign. Suffered teasing because of their physical appearance, or something about them that they couldn't change necessarily. And most of these boys who are responsible for school shootings actually have developed a plan, and have actually communicated their intentions to somebody before it happened. So I understand, of course, the need for uh, teachers, if we're talking about high school, or professors, if it's a college, or parents, or any type of people who are in a position to help, to be able to identify potential warning signs, because usually in almost all the cases before these shootings happen, uh, these guys will actually communicate their plan to somebody, and it's not taken seriously, or it might be taken too seriously, in the sense that people aren't people are just further demonizing the kids, and making it more likely that this type of violence is going to happen, instead of listening to them and trying to understand and trying to intervene. So there are correct ways to deal with these types of warning signs, to try to prevent this type of violence from happening. Um, Particularly when we know that most of them are going to make some type of implied or direct threat, right? But we also run into this issue that most people who make implied or direct threats, most people will say, I'm going to blow this place up. They're not serious about it. They're not going to commit a serious crime. So we do run the risk of overreacting, particularly when it comes to, say, like zero tolerance policies. I remember one instance of a zero tolerance policy is like uh, a 5-year-old or so was playing, just at recess, and was using his fingers, right, like doing cops and robbers type of things, and had the police call on him and was suspended from school. It's a 5-year-old, but you have a zero tolerance policy in the school, then it goes back to this whole idea that we were talking about last time in terms of using discretion, right? So sometimes we just have to use common sense, and not all if I go like this, bang, 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 or if I go, one is clearly a threat, one is not. One might just be playing, right? It's important for people in positions of power or in positions to actually do something to be able to make that distinction. Zero tolerance policies can be ineffective because they have the potential to kind of stigmatize students who might be at risk of committing some type of violence, but also mistakenly identify kids. What if, in the 90s in Columbine, it was the whole the trench coat mafia. So basically, all the goth kids in school kind of got unfairly targeted. I was friends with some of them. I would get some weed from them sometimes. I was part of the punk group, and we got targeted for other reasons there. But this idea of threat assessment, of actually taking a rational, community-based approach to understanding threats and assessing threats before you act on them in an unreasonable or reactive type of way. This type of threat assessment approach seems to hold some progress. So I believe I have a video here that kind of talks a little about a community type of threat assessment. Let me see. Just start that over. Sorry.
In Peterborough to help prevent violence. An agreement was signed this morning in Peterborough to help prevent violence in area schools. As Steve Guthrie reports, the community threat assessment protocol should help identify individuals who show the potential for violent acts.
All I remember was screaming and the people running.
Experts say outbreaks of violence at schools are often the final chapter of a tragic tale that had its first lines written years earlier. Very often the central figure has provided clues to potentially violent behavior.
Often schools had some information, sometimes even a frontline teacher knew something that the principal didn't know, let alone police may have had information that the school didn't know, counseling, mental health, etc. And it wasn't until after the fact that we started realizing we have to connect the dots beforehand.
A community threat assessment protocol was signed today by representatives of the local school boards, law enforcement, social services, and other community partners. The protocol includes staff training to recognize potentially violent behavior and for the rapid sharing of information to avert violence before it happens.
Professional organizations are so used to doing their own thing, working according to their own mandate, that we haven't really considered whether or not another agency or professional might have key information. But also Freedom of Information and Protection of Privacy Acts across the country have also complicated it, where many professionals have felt they can't share or ask questions of other agencies. And so the protocol, grounded as well in the laws of this country, have made it easier for people to recognize that.
That's 2 days of intensive training that's taking place to build the confidence level of staff in particular, to help them understand assessment criteria and then reach out to partners who will immediately be at the table to provide advice and plan around mitigating against the risks that they've presented with.
While the prevention of violence in schools is behind the protocol, all partners recognize the importance of helping the person who needs it most, the student who first made the threat.
I think it was expressed most appropriately. That's often a cry for help. and that child needs support, needs some services put in place, while of course we maintain his or her safety and the safety of others.
Steve Guthrie,
Okay,
Jack's News
so
Watch, Peterborough.
that video seemed like it was much more of a law and order type of approach to threat assessment, but I think the last guy that spoke kind of nailed it about what this community threat assessment is really all about. Is to identify actual threats, because most of the time we're really just dealing with students who are giving a cry for help, and that student should be supported and given the resources that he needs, while making sure that he doesn't have access to firearms, and that the rest of the community and the school is being safe. I'll just briefly describe, because I used to do crisis counseling at Long Island Crisis Center, and one of the main things that we used to do was a suicide threat assessment, because who among us haven't felt like, is all of this worth it, right? We've all kind of been there, kind of human nature. The idea has at least crossed your mind. If it hasn't, I would say you're among the lucky few. But it doesn't necessarily mean that somebody's going to do it just because they're talking about it. So when I would do crisis counseling, it was more than just a suicide hotline. I was trained to do counseling for pretty much any and every issue, but suicide was one of them. And if somebody had called and said that they were feeling suicidal, we would, number one, we would repeat it back to them and not just say, oh, you feel that you feel that you're suicidal. We would ask, how long have you wanted to kill yourself, right? So just putting it right out there. And sometimes them just hearing that back to them, like, whoa, you didn't even kill myself, because using suicide, or people tend to be afraid of addressing these types of issues head on. So we were always taught to address it head on, and part of the assessment was whether they had a plan to do it. So we would ask, I would ask, how do you plan on killing yourself? And if they had no plan, they're like, I don't know, I don't know, I just feel like I want to do it. Then we kind of didn't even need to go to the next step, because if there's no plan, then this is likely a call for help, all right, or a cry for help. But if they did have a plan, if they said, well, I'm gonna blow my brains out, that's how I'll do it. The next step would be to determine whether or not they actually had the means to follow up with their plan. So, the next question, I would again give their words back to them. So you're gonna blow your brains out. Do you have a gun? Do you have a gun? Do you have access to a gun? Right? And if they say, well, no, I don't, but I'm gonna go buy one, or I'll get one from my friend or something. Well, okay, so they don't have immediate access to actually completing their plan. So the threat level goes down, right? They still have a plan, but they don't have the means to complete it. This doesn't mean like we're done with the phone call or anything. Particularly for suicide calls, we would always try to get the caller to agree to call us back before they ever did anything to themselves, to kill themselves. And we would also try to get them to agree to allow us to call them, in a day or two or three, to kind of just check in with them. But let's say they had a plan and they say, yeah, I do have a gun. Okay, well now I'm worried at this point, right? Um, there's a final step to that threat assessment. Okay, so you have a plan, you have the means to enact the plan. Have you taken steps to enact the plan? So if they said, yeah, I have a gun, it's an actual phone call. I've had, um, so where's the gun, right? And then, well, it's right next to me. Oh, is it loaded? Do you have bullets in it? Yeah. Okay. Well, now this is well. Okay. This is what these are the calls you don't want to get, but the reason why you're there, right? So I've actually had I spent hours in this particular call. Spent hours on the phone talking with the guy, and got him to agree to step by step, just empty, take the bullets out of the gun, and can you put them away? Can you go put those in another room? Like, stay on the phone with me, but go put those in another room and go back to your bedroom. Like, you keep the gun there, just you can get the bullets out, and then step by step. Really, the worst thing that we wanted to do as counselors was to call the police. Especially, you can imagine, this is Long Island, right? You can imagine calling up the police and saying, I have a suicidal patient who has a loaded gun with them. That might not end well for this client, who might not even really be suicidal. It might just be some ideation. I mean, ultimately he called us before he did it, so he wanted someone to talk him out of it. The I'm starting to rant a little bit, but the times that our agency had to call um, the police, it never worked out well. I mean, it was a case of a caller who, told us that they drank a whole bunch of bleach. Well, we had to call somebody to save them, and they were taken out. A person who just tried to commit suicide, taken out in handcuffs, roughed up by the cops and taken out by handcuffs, and all the neighbors around. I mean, like, that's the last thing that you want to do, right? So my whole point in all of this is, using threat assessment is really important, and it could help you, make a right decision, and not make a bad situation even worse. Sorry for going off. That was a little bit of a rant there. Okay, so when it comes to let's say, why do people kill? Well, I mean, humans are an interesting bunch, right? And if you haven't taken my applied social psych class, I'll be teaching it next semester, 2 sections. So, shameless plug. You should take that, especially now that I have time to prep for it properly for an online class, which we'll likely end up doing. But humans are quite interesting. In the animal kingdom, I mean, we are part of the animal kingdom, so I'm not trying to separate us here. But let's say animals other than humans, there's really only two reasons why other animals kill, and that's to eliminate competition and for food, right? And we don't eat each other. hopefully most of us don't, right? That's not really good from an evolutionary perspective. Um, to eat your own species, you're not likely to last very long. But eliminate competition, that's certainly one reason why humans kill, right? So when we take a look at these biological theories of crime, they tend to, or they try to search for genetic vulnerabilities or genetic predispositions. So maybe they're not being a serial killer is not genetic per se, but maybe there's some type of genetic trait that's passed down that would make somebody more violent or less empathetic or more likely to connect sex or sexual desires um, with homicidal types of desires. Um, Biological theories will also search for neuropsychological abnormalities. So trying to find out is there something in the brain that kind of makes people killers, that makes them murderers, right? Or if there's some type of biochemical irregularities. Is it something with our neurotransmitters, so something with our hormones, or the way that our neurons are firing or misfiring, let's say. So when we talk about dispositions, dispositions might then be, so these genetic dispositions, again, genes don't operate, you can't get a serial killer gene. That's not how, like, genetics work. You might have some series of, or a combination of different genes that make you more predisposed to engage in some type of behavior, and that could be murderous type of behavior, but that type of genetic predisposition needs some type of environmental activation. It needs to interact with the environment in order to produce this type of behavior. So biological theories are going to, take a look at genetic predispositions or these neuropsychological predispositions, but also take a look at how these predispositions are interacting with the environment to cause these types of behaviors. In our case, for this lecture, it's murderous behaviors, right? So a number of twin studies have taken a look at trying to examine the genetic cause of criminal behavior, not just murder, but criminal behavior in general. And research suggests that that these inherited tendencies may actually play a crucial role in causing crime, particularly violent or aggressive crime. So there might actually be some inherited genetic predispositions. Now, again, that doesn't mean just like that there's a serial killer gene or anything. It just means that our genetic makeup can interact with the environment to bring out these types of traits. Again, when it comes to serial killers, those are very rare and unique individuals, and nobody really understands what's going on with them. And most of the time, they're put to death. They get the death penalty. And as a psychologist, I say, like we can't kill them. Like we gotta study them forever, right? Try to learn as much as possible about them because they're so rare. Except they create terror and they create headlines in the news. So they don't seem as rare as they actually are. So when we talk about potential causes, biological causes here, things that we might inherit, um, low MAOs. So these are your neurotransmitters that are responsible for mood regulation. So these are your serotonins and dopamine and norepinephrine. So low MAOs combined with maltreatment as a child, you know, having a quote unquote chemical imbalance combined with abuse as a child, neurological abnormalities uh, combined with maltreatment as a child or other type of trauma in an environment, hormonal differences, temperamental differences. Again, these biological differences or these biological dispositions, but they're always, the research shows that there's always some type of um, environmental trigger there or some other environmental cause there. Um, so I believe we have a video here. Let me just pause this quick to set it up. A video here of a neuroscientist who will talk about the brains of serial killers, and it's actually one of my favorite TED Talks. He's pretty cool guy, and it's a little bit of a twist ending there. But let's watch it together.
I'm a neuroscientist, a professor in the University of California, and over the past 35 years, I study behavior, but on the basis of everything from genes through neurotransmitters, dopamine, things like that, all the way through circuit analysis. So that's what I normally do. But then, for some reason, I got into something else just recently. And it all grew out of one of my colleagues asked me to analyze a bunch of brains of psychopathic killers. And so this would be the typical talk I would give. And the question is, how do you end up with a psychopathic killer? What I mean by psychopathic killer are these people, these types of people. And so some of the brains that I've studied are people you know about. When I get the brains, I don't know what I'm looking at. It's a blind experiment. They give me normal people and everything. So I've looked at about 70 of these and came up and saw a number of pieces of data. So we look at these sorts of things theoretically on the basis of genetics and brain damage and the interaction with environment and exactly how that machine works. So we're interested in exactly where in the brain and what's the most important part of the brain. So we've been looking at this, the interaction of genes, what's called epigenetic effects, brain damage, and environment, and how these are timed. And how you end up with a psychopath and a killer depends on exactly when the damage occurs. It's really a very precisely timed thing. You get different kinds of psychopaths. So we're going along with this, and here's just to give you the pattern. And the pattern is that those people, every one of them I looked at who was a murderer and who was a serial killer, had damage to their orbital cortex, which is right above the eyes, the orbits, and also the anterior part of the temporal lobe. So there's this pattern that every one of them had, but they all were a little different too. They had other sorts of brain damage. The key thing is that the major violence genes is called the MAOA gene. And there's a variant of this gene that is in the normal population. Some of you have this. And it's sex-linked. It's on the X chromosome. And so in this way, you can only get it from your mother. And in fact, this is probably why mostly men, boys, are psychopathic killers, are very aggressive. Because, the daughter can get one X from the father, one X from the mother. It's kind of diluted out. But for a son, he could only get the X chromosome from his mother. So this is how it's passed from mother to son. And it has to do with too much serotonin during development. It's kind of interesting because serotonin is supposed to make you calm and relaxed. But if you have this gene in utero, your brain is bathed in this. So your whole brain becomes insensitive to serotonin, so it doesn't work, later on. And I had given this one talk in Israel just this past year, and it does have some consequences. And theoretically, what this means is that in order to express this gene in a violent way, very early on, before puberty, you have to be involved in something that's really traumatic. Not a little stress, not being spanked or something, but really seeing violence or being involved in it in 3D. Right? This is how the mirror neuron system works. And so if you have that gene and you see a lot of violence in a certain situation, this is the recipe for disaster, absolute disaster. And what I think might happen in these areas of the world where we have constant violence, you end up having generations of kids that are seeing all this violence. And if I was a young girl somewhere in a violent area, a 14-year-old, and I want to, find a mate, I'd find some tough guy, right, to protect me. Well, what the problem is, this tends to concentrate these genes. And now the boys and the girls get them. So I think after several generations, and here's the idea, we really have a tinderbox. So that was the idea. But then my mother said to me, I hear you've been going around talking about psychopathic killers. And you're talking as if you come from a normal family. I said, what the hell are you talking about? She then told me about her own family tree. Now, she blamed this on my father's side, of course. This was one of these cases because she has no violence in her background. But my father did. Well, she said there's good news and bad news. One of your cousins is Ezra Cornell, founded Cornell University. But the bad news is that your cousin's also Lizzie Borden. Now, I said, okay, so what? We have Lizzie. She goes, no, it gets worse. Read this book. And here's this Killed Strangely, and it's a historical book. And the first murder of a mother by a son was my great-great-great-great-grandfather. Okay, so that's the first case of matricide. And the book is very interesting because it's about the witch trials and how people thought back then. But it doesn't stop there. There were 7 more men on my father's side, starting then, Cornell's, that were all murderers. Okay? Now, this, gives one a little pause, because my father himself and my 3 uncles in World War II were all conscientious objectors. They're all pussycats. But every once in a while, Lizzie Borden, like 3 times a century, and we're kind of due. And so the moral of the story is, people in glass houses shouldn't throw stones, but more likely is this. And we had to take action. Now, our kids found out about it, and they all seem to be okay, but our grandkids are going to be kind of concerned here. So what we've done is I started to do PET scans of everybody in the family. And we started to do PET scans, EEGs, and genetic analysis to see where the bad news is. Now, the only person, it turns out, one son and one daughter, siblings, didn't get along, and their patterns are exactly the same. They have the same brain and the same EEG, and now they're as close as can be. But there's going to be bad news somewhere, and we don't know where it's going to pop up. So that's right there.
Okay. So, like I said, that dude's one of my. That guy is one of my favorite neuroscientists, and taking a look at brain scans, you'll find out little later on in the semester. I'm kind of skeptical about brain scans and what they tell us about criminal behavior, but that guy's pretty cool, and he has some pretty cool research there. And what he said is consistent with what the research suggests. I won't play this clip now because it's pretty long, 22 minutes, and I promised you I'd give you shorter lectures. But if you wanted to watch, I have 2 more videos after that Jim Fallon video. The one deals with Jeffrey Dahmer, a serial killer from Milwaukee, and from what the research shows, by all measures, he did not have any major traumatic event that we saw Jim Fallon say is necessary, Dr. Jim Fallon say, is necessary in order to create these types of psychopathic killers. But Jeffrey Dahmer's story is, and Jeffrey Dahmer as a serial killer is actually pretty unusual. And I'll just give you a teaser if you want to to try to encourage you to go watch this video, because I have the lecture slides posted for you, so you could watch it on your own time. But Jeffrey Dahmer said that when through interviews, so we're relying on Jeffrey Dahmer here, but he said that killing his victims was never the actual goal. It wasn't what got him off. Again, figuratively and literally, Jeffrey Dahmer was interested in creating sex zombies. Essentially, he had severe rejection issues and severe attachment issues. So he would kidnap young guys in his neighborhood, and basically, he would sleep with them, or pay, to sleep with them. And when they tried to leave, he would end up, killing them. He had, according to him, this severe, fear of abandonment. So ultimately, what he did, because he realized he had been killing these people, is that he would try to create essentially a zombie, a sex zombie, somebody who would never leave him. And he tried to do this through various methods, one of them being to drill a hole in the head of his victim and pour either boiling water into the brain to try to do like a makeshift lobotomy, or to pour muriatic acid, hydrochloric acid, into the brains. And that he ended up killing a lot of people in his quest to create this type of sex zombie, as he described them. Jeffrey Dahmer was also a cannibal. There's plenty of evidence to suggest that he consumed parts of his victims, and he admits as much. And he said that was a way for his victims to always be with him, so that they left him, so to speak, when he killed them. So they left this world and left him behind, but by consuming a part of their body, their liver or piece of their bicep muscle or something, he was able to feel like they were always with him. So I don't know, that's coming from a serial killer there. Some people call bullshit on his story, particularly because in this interview as well, his father says that he too had some kinds of homicidal feelings growing up, but that he was able to kind of control them. So he was able to get a handle on them and not end up killing anybody. And you have to wonder if that's just his dad trying to say, it's not my son's fault, right? It's his genes, it's his genetics. And the Jeffrey Dahmer story is definitely an interesting one. So hopefully I piqued your curiosity enough that you'll go ahead and watch this video. And then after this one, I actually have a shorter video that deals with what to do when you have like a psychopathic child. So a child who doesn't show any type of emotion when it comes to the feelings of other people. So they don't show any type of empathy or any type of remorse. It's a interesting little video that it kind of takes a look at parents who are dealing with raising children who are psychopaths. So I'll end this lecture here because it's an hour and 16 minutes, so that's the closest to an actual in-class lecture length that I've gotten so far, so I'm going to try to be good, but I highly suggest you go watch these videos. So especially if you're on lockdown and you got nowhere else to go, these videos are better than anything you'll find on Netflix. I promise you. That's why I put them in here. Okay. All of you take care of yourself, be safe, and enjoy the weekend. So I'll see you next week. All right. Take care, everyone. Bye bye.